all good. Okay, Karthik.
Okay, cool. Yay. Hey, everybody. Thank you for coming to today's pair programming session. I want to take 5 minutes to discuss Design Doc 101 plus Feedback 101. As you might know, I'm a software engineer at Pinterest, and these are some learnings that I've gathered at Pinterest, and I think these are things we can try incorporating in the Deep Learning Playground team, like in terms of our daily operations. So the first half of the presentation will go into Design Doc basics, and the second half of the presentation will go into giving and receiving feedback, like the basics of how that works. And I wanted to make this presentation as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions, feel free to, give me a holler, and we can totally keep this session as informative as possible for everybody. So without further ado, let's get started. So the first topic I wanted to cover is Design Doc 101. So I guess before we dive into what a design doc is, we need to understand why we write design docs, right? So in short, a design doc in the software engineering industry or in the tech industry, like as a whole, from my understanding, is essentially a document to keep track of the project you're doing. So let's say at work you're trying to build some sort of feature for a defined application, but the thing is the feature is a little bit complex, and you need to somehow have a centralized way to note down what are the requirements and what is the plan of action for this feature. So this ties into the first reason of why we write design docs. Are you all there?
Yep, we're all still here. Aniket just joined.
Oh, okay. Hey, Aniket. I'm just currently in the presentation right now. So yeah, as I was saying, why write design docs? So the first reason is very important. Written communication is much, much better than keeping everything in your head. So if you were to build, say, some feature for Deep Learning Playground, for example, you could totally have the idea in your head and it seems clear to you, but until you get it written on the paper, it's really not much of anything, right? So written communication is very, very important because a paper trail is what will make people care about what you do, right? You need some sort of evidence that you actually built this feature and you put some thought into it. So written communication is very important. And one thing that design docs force you to do by the nature of it is you're forced to think systematically of how you can approach a big problem. So there's many ways of approaching a problem. One way could be just approaching it head on, or another way could be breaking the problem down into smaller pieces. And writing a design doc will force you to think through these approaches and evaluate what are the trade-offs behind these approaches so that you can pick a good direction for your project. And another thing that design docs help you with, as a corollary to the first two bullet points, is you can establish a single source of truth regarding a given project. So if somebody asks you, hey, what is the status of Project X, or how does Project X work? You can literally send them a link to a Google Doc or a Microsoft Word doc containing the design of your project, what is the roadmap, so that everyone is on the same page and people can come back to you and ask more pointed questions about your project. And last but not least, with the advent of Google Docs, Microsoft Word, OneDrive, and various cloud services, design docs are in a written form are shareable in that you can send the doc to somebody or your team and they can totally leave comments about it. And you can also have a discussion about this written trail. So something more concrete to talk about. So does anybody have questions about why we write design docs? I'm going to take that as you guys understand this, and let's move to the next slide. Oh, someone had a question?
No, I don't have a question. You could.
Okay, so in terms of design docs, there's a couple types of design docs, and some of this is Pinterest, some of this is what I've seen at my workplace, and some of this is pretty general. So there's a couple types of design docs. There's definitely multiple types, but these are the common ones I see. So the first type is called a technical design doc. This is what we call a one-pager in industry. So a TDD is a good fit for projects/tasks at a relatively small scope. And if you write this doc well, this doc should be literally a quick skim through. And for TDDs, conciseness is super important. And the rule of thumb you want to aim for is 1 to 2 pages. So this is more for quick, well-defined tasks that are small in scope and they're not super big business critical impact. Now, a PRD on the other hand tends to be longer than a TDD, and they're more for bigger projects with a lot more complexity than a well-defined task. And these can be 5+ pages long, but there's no hard fast rule on the page limit. Again, with TDDs and PRDs, the key is conciseness. If you had to take anything from design docs, being concise and succinct is very important because it helps the reader understand your project better. And Yeah, so that's what a TDD and a PRD is. In terms of deciding which one you should use, which one you should write between TDDs and PRDs, it totally depends on the complexity of the task. It also depends on, you know, what do you need to describe to understand the project slash task slash, engineering undertaking. So this should be made with good judgment in mind. So in terms of now that we have an idea of the types of design docs, what the deliverable could look like, and why we write design docs, now that we're on the same page with that, it's important to understand, okay, so what the heck do I need to do to write a design doc? We need some sort of structure, right? And this is a general structure that I've seen or used in my own design docs in practice. So the first and foremost thing you need in a structure for a design doc is problem description. So first and foremost, what is the problem you're trying to solve, right? What are you trying to solve? And what is the relevant background context or information that the reader needs to know? That way, everyone is on equal footing when they read your doc. So now that we have the problem description settled, the next thing we need to talk about is, okay, if we have a problem to solve, what is the approach? And there can be multiple approaches to a problem. And this approaches section is meant to, for you to deep dive into what are the possible directions you could go to solve the problem and what are the trade-offs, right? And for each approach, it's good to have a design. So as they say, a picture is worth 8,000 words. So a good design doc should have a good amount of visuals because humans tend to be naturally visual learners from what I've seen. And if you have a diagram, you can communicate the same point in an image instead of walls and walls of text. So visuals are much, much better than lots of text. In terms of the design aspect of a design doc, they can be architecture diagrams. So, those UML diagrams you study in objects and design, like DCD diagrams, class diagrams, model view controller architecture diagrams. Those count as diagrams. If you're building a feature with the UI, it might be good to have a Figma mockup. This is where you would typically work with a designer, or you come up with the mockup yourself to get it reviewed from other people. So that's the design section. So this is diagrams. So architecture, backend design, Figma mockups, if you're going to do anything UI UX related, and visuals are better than walls and walls of text. Now that you have the problem description, the approaches, and design written out, now we need to understand the analysis. So you have approaches 1, 2, 3, for example. We need to understand what is the risk trade-off, right? What is the cost benefit analysis? So maybe approach 1 could cost more in engineering time, but it might be beneficial for the long run. Or maybe approach 2 might be quicker to do, but there might be more overhead later down the road. So you need to understand what is the risk and trade-off of various solutions to your problem. And also for a problem you're trying to solve, is the problem even a real thing, right? Like, is this an actual pressing problem that you should be solving, right? So you want to understand what is the opportunity for your project. And opportunity can take the form of revenue opportunity. So what is the monetary impact with your potential project? So you can take some data that you have historically and crunch together some projections using the best of your knowledge. Or you can see what stakeholders think. If stakeholders are complaining about a common pain point, then even though your project might not necessarily drive revenue immediately, for example, your project could totally save time on the stakeholder side and make their lives easier. So that's still impact. So you want to think about the quantitative and qualitative side when we're assessing opportunity for a project. And this could help you decide between which project is worth prioritizing if you have many projects you're trying to choose from. So this design doc helps you to really understand the problem space. Now that you have the problem description, approaches, design, and cost benefit analysis, we also need to understand how are you going to implement your solution, right? How are we going to tackle this, right? What is the roadmap? That's what a timeline is for. And once you have these 5 components, it's also good to link supplemental resources, especially for any miscellaneous information you have that is discussed in detail in other docs. An appendix is useful if people want to understand more detail related to your project or related to other projects that happened in the past or happening. So that's the basic structure of a design doc. I know it's a mouthful, but does anybody have questions about the structure immediately?
Quick question. So is the structure the same both in the TDD and the PDD, the other one?
I would say the structure that I have outlined here, these ingredients are common in both a PRD and a TDD, except in a PRD, it's a lot more fleshed out because they tend to be bigger projects and more complex things. So you're going to have to flesh out your approach a lot more detail. But for a TDD, it's usually much crisper, and also like you can think about problem description approaches, design analysis, timeline appendix as essentially sort of like a guiding tool, right? You might not need to describe like design diagrams for example, for a small UI fix, right? You might not need to describe complicated Figma mockups, especially if that's well known. So it's good to use your best judgment in terms of what you need. But these ingredients I listed here are general things you should include in a good doc.
Okay, so
But it's
in
up to you
general,
to,
a design doc, they don't tell everything about a project, right? Like the specifics are just left out for development, something like that.
yeah, so design doc is more of like, here's the problem I'm trying to solve. This is the approaches I'm taking. Here's the potential design I want to go in. Here's the analysis. Here's the game plan. But in terms of the hard engineering execution, so for example, if you were trying to implement train space, for example, that's a great example of DLP. Daniel probably had to identify what is the problem, right? He also identified how can we solve this or alleviate. And he had to also think about a UI UX design. In fact, he drew up a mock-up, like literally on a tablet. And he also kind of mentally discussed what is the analysis like with the team, right? In terms of what is the risk trade-off of implementing a train space and what is the benefit we get in the long run. In terms of the hard engineering design, in terms of like the JavaScript implementation and along with the database design, like the specifics of that, that's more left to the edge side. But a design doc is more for like a little bit higher level than raw like nitty gritty.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else have any questions about the structure?
Wait, I might have missed, what is a purity stand for again?
So a PRD stands for project requirement doc, and a TDD stands for technical design doc.
Okay.
Most companies call PRDs project docs, but at least at Pinterest, we call them PRDs. So they're the same idea. Okay, cool. So if you guys don't have any questions about structure, that takes care of how we're supposed to write these design docs and TDDs. And obviously, it's good to exercise your judgment as to which parts of the structure are needed for your use case versus which parts don't really matter as much. And the last point I wanted to discuss about design docs is tips, right? So you guys understand, we have a good understanding as to what is the structure of a design doc, why we write a design doc, and what is the deliverable of a design doc. But I think it's good to understand tips for writing design docs because especially when you guys enter industry, design docs, you might not get it perfect the first time. You might not even get it perfect the second, third, fourth, fifth time. It comes with a lot of practice. But these are some tips that I've learned about design docs, and hopefully these might help you when you get to that point in your career where you need to write a project doc to describe something you're trying to build. So the first tip I think is the most interesting. Complex ideas are easy to write down, but simple ideas are much harder. Now, what do I mean by that? A complex idea is one that sounds too hard to understand, right? Like you have to give some sort of cognitive load in order to understand this complex idea or this menagerie, right? And that's easy to write down because at the end of the day, that's more brain dumping. But simple ideas are much harder. If you have simple ideas written out in your design doc, it really shows to the reader that you have took so much effort from your end to think through a design that has been so well thought out to the point that even a non-technical person can understand it. Like if I read a good design doc, I want to walk away at the understanding that, wow, this is so simple to understand. And this person really put a lot of thought into the design. And it really gives respect to the reader's time too, especially if those readers are other product managers, designers, other engineers on your team, maybe your team lead, maybe your manager. You're respecting everybody's time by taking the effort from your end to make the simple ideas written down on the paper and make those shine. Another thing you want to keep in mind with design docs, this is related to Ferris's question, but design docs shouldn't necessarily be focused on raw nitty-gritty specifics. You want to really keep in mind your target audience. So a couple audiences you might want to keep in mind for a design doc in industry include other engineers on your team, plus any cross-functional teams, cross-functional stakeholders. So they can be anybody in the company that's really not on the end side that has some sort of impact by your work. The product manager on your team could also be a good target audience. Maybe your manager and your skip manager potentially. So you want to think about the target audience as people from all different backgrounds, either from an edge background or from a product background or from a design background, they should all be able to understand what you're trying to build without having to exert too much cognitive load. The third tip is aim for succinctness and brevity, right? So if you make your thoughts more succinct, then your design docs won't be walls of text and they won't be like 10 pages when you can express the same idea in 5 pages. So succinctness and brevity is something that takes time. I'm definitely working on this myself on my end though, especially at work. And I think to get good at succinctness and brevity, you want to get feedback, as fast as you can when you're writing a design doc, because you might get other eyeballs and other perspectives on your writing, and that will help you improve on your succinctness. Another thing you want to think about design docs is when you write something down on paper, it is not necessarily the finalized copy. You're usually going to write it as a draft. And if the draft is in a decent enough state that you can share it with other people, then you want to share the ready enough draft to other people on your team or other stakeholders and get their input on it. And then you should address their comments, and you have this draft plus rewrite cycle essentially going. Because good writing can't come out in 24 hours. It takes time. And it takes time for the ideas to marinate in. So the draft plus rewrite cycle is something you should be grateful for and definitely take full advantage of. And the last tip is seeking continuous feedback from others on your design, even if you aren't at a polished state, is very important, right? The more feedback you get, the sooner or later, you can iron out most of the risk early on, and you also get people on the same page quicker. In fact, in industry, you can't just really build anything as a lone wolf, right? You really have to get visibility, right? People should know what you're doing, why you're doing it, what the impact is. That way they can vouch for you when it comes time to, do performance reviews or select people for various projects. People who have a lot of visibility get recognized. So that's what the tips I have for design doc. Does anybody have any questions about design doc tips? Or should I move on to the next slide? I'm guessing that you guys need to understand the design doc tips. So that wraps up design doc 101. The next topic I wanted to cover is feedback 101. So in industry, feedback is very important to give and receive. Feedback helps other people deliver input on how you can grow as an individual. And in your career, you really can't stagnate, especially in software engineering. You can't stagnate at all in your career because the tech is changing. And also, if you're not growing, right, you really aren't being challenged enough. So continual growth matters a lot in your career. And feedback is the catalyst to identify where you can grow and improve. And also, in general, in life, learning how to accept feedback and putting it into practice is likely to make your manager happy. And it also shows that you have a sense of humility. You aren't just like ignoring what people say. You're making yourself easy to work with. So this is the motivation for why feedback. But we have two ends of feedback. One side is giving good feedback. So when you give good feedback, one of the important things I like to think about is when you're giving feedback to somebody, you want to focus your suggestions on the behavior displayed and not on the person. So why do I say this? Well, feedback is easily given in the wrong way, and people who feel like feedback is addressed directly to them as a person perceive the feedback as an ad hominem attack. So for example, if you look at, Trump, for example, right, not calling names, like, how politicians usually like to talk about other people and kind of, say that, oh, politician X is gonna make America bad, or they're gonna do their policies suck, right? That stuff lives in the political world, but in the corporate world, ad hominem attacks usually don't help anybody. And you want to usually, and a good engineering culture requires it to be blameless, in my opinion. So you don't want to really you don't really want to give feedback in such a way that you're blaming people for who they are, because people are different at the end of the day, and you really can't change somebody magically, but you can totally address behaviors that could be improved. So that leads me to the second bullet point. People receive feedback differently and need to read the room in order to give others time to process it. For example, if I get feedback from somebody and I seem to be a little bit, antsy, right? I seem to have, palm sweaty, my cheeks seem to be flushed. That's probably a sign that you need to give the other person time to process the feedback and talk about this in a later meeting. And the third thing about giving feedback is there's both positives and negative feedback. but you want to frame negative feedback into constructive criticism because no one is perfect. Everyone can improve and get better. And the worst thing you could do to somebody is tearing people down unnecessarily, right? If you're roasting somebody about like, for example, how bad they are at JavaScript, you're not really helping them improve. You're really lowering their self-esteem and you're really making them feel less incentivized to improve. So you want to turn negative feedback into constructive criticism. And the wordings definitely depend on the person, but it takes a lot of practice to give good constructive criticism feedback. And tone matters a lot when you're delivering feedback. In fact, 55% of communication is nonverbal, 38% is vocal, and 7% is words alone. So the raw words you deliver don't really mean as much, but the nonverbal cues that other people are giving you in reaction to your feedback matter a lot. And that ties in a bit to the second tip I mentioned about people receiving feedback differently. So that's the gist of giving good feedback. And here's some examples of not so good feedback. I'm sure you've probably given this type of feedback to other people or pointed it out to other people. So like saying, you never clean up the dishes because you're lazy. You always prolong the meeting with your ridiculous points. You always cause production to crash. You aren't trying hard enough. You're too slow to pick up on React.js. Other people picked up on our code base in 2 days. Why is it so hard for you? Why can't you be more like Bob? Bob at least doesn't talk back to me and gets things done. You constantly slow down other developers' velocity. In fact, if you're reading this not so good feedback, imagine if you were like in the shoes of the feedback recipient and you were given this type of feedback, you probably wouldn't feel as good, right? And you can probably tell from these examples that most of these not so good feedbacks tie into the ad hominem attack because you're blaming the person for the problem instead of really the behavior. So when you're giving feedback, try to avoid falling into this bucket. And other people will probably point it out through nonverbal cues. So these are some examples of not so good feedback. Before I move to the next slide, does anybody have questions about giving feedback? Okay, I guess I'll move to the next slide. So in terms of being a good giver of feedback, you also have to consider the end of receiving feedback because communication is a two-way street. Somebody's saying something, someone else receives it, right? And then the communication goes back and forth. So you also want to be a good receiver of feedback. And here's a couple of tips on how to be a good receiver. Number one, try to refrain from getting very defensive when others give feedback. For example, right, negative feedback can sometimes hurt, right? But instead of being defensive and pouncing at the feedback giver, take some time to process the feedback. Listen and really jot down the feedback. In fact, listening is just as important as communicating. Really sad thing in my opinion is sometimes our culture really doesn't incentivize it, but I think listening is much, much more powerful than, always jumping the gun. So the second thing you have the power to do as a receiver of feedback is you can totally inform the feedback provider if you need to take time to process the feedback, especially if there's a feedback you don't disagree with. If there's a feedback that you disagree with or you seem to not understand the suggestion, you are totally allowed to ask the feedback provider if you need to take time to process. Everyone has different mileage and you want to be, cognizant of that for yourself and also as a feedback giver. And feedback itself isn't good enough if you can't action on it. So you want to really come up with a plan for how to put the feedback in practice. Work with the feedback giver to see if we can come up with a game plan or like a goal for how you can put the feedback into practice. How can you measure improvement? How do we know if you've improved on this certain point, right? What is a good cadence for when you should check in to see, are you on the right track? And you're also allowed to politely disagree with the feedback received. But keep in mind that if you keep disagreeing with every single feedback, people aren't as motivated to give you any feedback because you'll always get this defensive and it just doesn't become a good conversation. So when you're trying to disagree with feedback, do so politely and do it in moderation. And just like being a good giver of feedback, you want to refrain from ad hominem attacks toward the feedback giver, right? Ad hominem attacks usually don't make anyone feel good. So it's a lose-lose situation. And finally, you want to take ownership of any feedback. No one is perfect, but it's one thing to blame other people for your problems. And it's another thing to actually take ownership and take responsibility. So if you're getting some feedback, it's totally valid to say something like, I take ownership of my shortcomings on this thread. Let's work together on an action plan to help each other improve. This type of mentality really goes a long way and it helps you become more self-critical of yourself and that you have the ability to not really wear the rosy glasses, right? And see all like, dandelions and daisies, right? So taking ownership of feedback is in general important in life, but also important in the corporate atmosphere, especially if you're trying to improve. And you also want to be thankful for even receiving feedback in the first place, because feedback is to be treated as a gift. And if you don't really show gratefulness for the feedback you're receiving, why would others be incentivized to give you the feedback that you need? So that wraps up my presentation on Design Doc 101 and Feedback 101. I'd like to open up the floor to questions and see if anybody has any concerns about these things.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk, Karthik. I think I learned a lot, especially on the design docs, but also the talk on the feedback is a very important one. On your point about which one, like refraining from being defensive and disagreeing on the feedback, you once, this actually reminded me of something you told me a few months ago, paraphrasing, be firm in your idea, but be flexible to change. And I think the idea is, to, when you have an idea, make sure you believe in it and make sure that you have points to defend it. But when other people, disagree with it, definitely defend your idea, but definitely be open to ideas and other perspectives.
Yeah. Yep, exactly. I think one of the sayings that I got from somebody I worked with, like one of my past colleagues, was that it's good to have good engineers tend to have strong ideas but hold them loosely.
Yeah, that's exactly what he said.
Yeah. So I think that's super important though. I think, yeah, Versa, do you have any questions? Or I think Amy and Aniket were having some questions.
I'm good.
Yeah, I don't think I have any questions, but I think like the slides on feedback really reinforce some of the things I have, touched upon before. So it was good. Thank you.
Cool. Aniket?
Oh, Aniket exited the meeting a few minutes ago. He had something.
Oh, okay. Okay, cool. Yeah, so I guess since this meeting is being recorded, you can totally post it in the Discord and other people can listen to it like when they have the time.
Yeah. Definitely can.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, thank you so much, Karthik. Let me just stop this recording.